at 46. Daniel Mercer wasn't just bankrupt. He had lost the trucking company he'd spent 20 years building. His savings were gone, his reputation had crumbled, and the only thing left in his bank account wasn't even enough to rent a room for a month. When a county tax auction listed a forgotten lockkeeper's house along an abandoned American canal for just $150, everyone in the room laughed as he raised his hand. They called it a money pit, a collapsing shack that no one had wanted for decades, and some even joked he'd managed to go bankrupt twice in the same year. But 3 weeks later, while replacing rotten floorboards inside that forgotten house, Daniel's crowbar struck something hollow beneath the floor. Hidden below was a sealed wooden chest that had remained untouched for more than a century. Inside were the handwritten diaries of canal workers whose names had vanished from history. And what Daniel read on the very first page would change not only his life, but an entire town's understanding of its past. Before we uncover what those forgotten pages revealed,
I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Leave a comment to say hello. And if you're enjoying stories about hidden American history, forgotten places, and extraordinary second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. Wherever you are, have a wonderful day. And now, let's go back to the moment when Daniel believed his life was already over.
The bankruptcy hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. 20 years of work disappeared with a judge's signature and a stack of papers Daniel Mercer could barely bring himself to read. At 46, he walked out of the county courthouse carrying everything he still owned in a worn backpack and a cardboard box filled with old business records that no longer meant anything. The summer sun was bright, but it offered no comfort. He stopped beside his aging pickup truck, opened his wallet, and counted what remained. After paying the last legal fees, he had barely enough money to survive a few weeks. His trucking company was gone. The bank had taken the office, the trailers, and every truck except the rusted pickup that was too old to interest anyone. Even the family home had disappeared years earlier in the divorce. For the first time since he was 19, Daniel had nowhere he could honestly call home. He sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. The dashboard rattled as if the truck itself were tired of holding together. He drove without a destination until a roadside diner caught his attention. A cup of coffee was cheaper than another hour of thinking alone. Inside, construction workers filled one corner while retirees quietly discussed local news. Daniel unfolded the newspapers someone had left behind. Most of the headlines blurred together until a small notice near the back caught his eye. County tax foreclosure auction. Abandoned properties. Thursday morning. He almost laughed. He had spent years trying to avoid foreclosure notices, and now they were somehow inviting him back. Still, curiosity made him fold the page and slip it into his pocket. The next morning, he parked outside the county administration building where barely 24 people had gathered. Most were experienced investors studying property lists with practiced confidence. Daniel recognized none of them. He scanned the auction catalog. Vacant lots, old garages, farm sheds. Every property quickly climbed beyond what he could afford. He lowered his bidding paddle again and again without ever raising it. Then the auctioneer announced the final listing. Former lockkeeper's house, Canal Road. Minimum bid, $150. A faded photograph appeared on the screen behind him. The small brick house leaned slightly toward the abandoned canal. Broken windows stared like empty eyes. Weeds climbed over the stone steps, and part of the roof had collapsed near the chimney. Someone in the audience chuckled. That place should have been torn down 40 years ago. Another man shook his hand. "Costs more to haul away than it's worth." The auctioneer smiled politely. "Do I have 150?" Silence filled the room. Daniel kept looking at the photograph. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't practical. But it was the only property he could possibly afford. A place with walls, however damaged, still felt different from sleeping in his truck. Before he had time to question himself, he lifted his paddle. Laughter spread through several rows. One investor leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Guess bankruptcy doesn't teach common sense." Daniel pretended not to notice. The auctioneer looked around once more. "Any higher bids?" None came. "Sold. $150. The wooden gavel struck. Just like that. Daniel Mercer owned a forgotten lockkeeper's house beside a canal that most people had forgotten even existed. The paperwork took another hour. A county clerk handed him a ring with 2 old iron keys attached by rusted wire. "You'll probably need new locks," she said with an apologetic smile, "if the doors are still standing." Daniel thanked her, tucked the keys into his pocket, and drove toward Canal Road using directions copied from an old county map. The farther he traveled, the narrower the roads became. Trees crowded both sides until the abandoned canal finally appeared beside him, its still water reflecting tangled branches. The little brick house stood exactly where the photograph had shown, weathered but stubbornly upright. Grass reached his knees as he walked toward the porch. One shutter hung loose, tapping softly against the wall in the breeze. He unlocked the front door after several attempts and stepped inside. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight. The rooms were nearly empty except for a cracked table, a rusted stove, and shelves that had long since sagged beneath their own weight. It smelled of damp wood and forgotten years. Yet something about the place felt peaceful instead of hopeless. Daniel set his backpack on the floor and looked around. "I guess it's just you and me now," he murmured. As he stepped back onto the porch before sunset, an elderly man walking along the canal slowed for a moment, studied the house, then looked directly at Daniel. "You're the new owner." Daniel nodded. The man hesitated before offering a faint, uneasy smile. "I hope you prove everyone wrong." He continued walking, then paused without turning around. "Just remember, nobody's managed to stay in that house longer than one winter." Daniel spent his first night inside the lockkeeper's house in a sleeping bag spread across the least damaged corner of the front room. The roof creaked whenever the wind crossed the abandoned canal, and somewhere inside the walls, mice scratched through dry wood. He slept lightly, waking more than once to the unfamiliar sounds of an old building settling into the cool night. Yet when dawn filtered through the cracked windows, he realized he had slept under a roof that belonged to him. It was the smallest victory of his life, but after months of losing everything, it mattered. He brewed instant coffee on a small camping stove beside the doorway and began making a list. Broken windows, leaking roof, rotten porch boards, sagging floors, rusted plumbing. Every item seemed expensive, and every dollar he spent would have to be carefully measured. By mid-morning, he had already filled 2 truckloads with broken furniture, collapsed shelves, and decades of trash left behind by previous owners or curious trespassers behind the house. Weeds nearly swallowed the narrow stone path leading toward the canal. Daniel followed it until he reached the old lock chamber, although the water barely moved now. He could still imagine barges waiting patiently while the lock filled and emptied almost 2 centuries earlier. Massive stone walls stood weathered but solid, their craftsmanship surviving long after the commerce they once served had disappeared. Returning to the house, he noticed several deep marks carved into the wooden door frame beside the kitchen entrance. At first, they looked like random scratches left by tools, but after brushing away dirt with a stiff cloth, he realized they formed neat rows of numbers and letters. Some had faded almost beyond recognition. Others remained surprisingly sharp. L12, he read quietly. Below it was another, L13. Farther down appeared L15 and L16. The sequence seemed deliberate, not accidental. He searched the rest of the house and found similar markings inside the pantry, near a back window, and even on one ceiling beam exposed where old plaster had fallen away. None of them made immediate sense. After lunch, Daniel drove into the nearest town to buy roofing tar, nails, and inexpensive plywood. The cashier directed him toward a lumber yard on the edge of town, where a local carpenter sometimes helped homeowners with difficult repairs. The lumber yard smelled of fresh-cut pine. A tall man in his 30s loaded fence posts onto a trailer while joking with another customer. When Daniel introduced himself and explained he had recently bought the old lock-keeper's house, the carpenter paused. "You're serious?" Daniel smiled. "Seems everybody asks that." The man laughed. "I'm Noah Ellis." They shook hands. "I've driven past that place my whole life. Never figured anyone would move in." Daniel admitted he couldn't afford professional contractors, but could use advice on stabilizing the roof before the next rainstorm. Noah studied the supply list. "You're planning to do most of it yourself." "I'll have to." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "Tell you what, I've got a couple free hours tomorrow morning. I'll stop by and show you where to start. It'll save you from fixing the wrong things first." Daniel thanked him more than once. Genuine kindness had become rare during the months leading to bankruptcy. Most conversations since then had involved creditors, lawyers, or people politely explaining why they could no longer help. Noah simply offered his time. The next morning, the carpenter arrived exactly when promised, carrying his own ladder and toolbox. Together, they climbed onto the roof and replaced several loose boards before spreading temporary patches over the largest leaks. The work was slow, but Daniel found satisfaction in every small repair. Each hammer strike made the house feel a little less abandoned. During a break, Noah glanced toward the canal. "Hard to believe boats lined up here every day once." "I was thinking the same thing," Daniel replied. "Seems strange that almost nobody talks about it now." Noah shrugged. "People drive over the bridges without giving them a second thought. Guess history gets quiet after long enough." Later, while reinforcing a back doorway, Daniel pointed out the carved markings he had discovered. Noah wiped dust from one with his thumb. "Those aren't random. You recognize them?" "Not exactly, but they remind me of lock numbers." This canal had dozens of locks stretching across the state. Daniel frowned. "Then why would someone carve them inside this house?" Noah shook his head. "Couldn't tell you." Curious, Daniel unfolded the old county map he had received with the property papers. The abandoned canal appeared clearly, but many lock numbers had faded or disappeared entirely on newer printings. The numbers carved into the wood did not match the map in any obvious order. Instead, they seemed to skip certain locks while repeating others. Noah traced one finger across the map before stepping back. Maybe whoever lived here had their own system. Daniel carefully photographed each carving with his phone before covering them again to protect the weathered wood. They might mean nothing at all, but something told him they had been placed there intentionally. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered overhead. Rain began falling just as they carried the last sheets of plywood inside. Water still slipped through several cracks despite their repairs, dripping steadily into old buckets Daniel had scattered across the rooms. "We'll get ahead of it eventually," Noah said as he packed his tools. "Old houses test your patience." After Noah drove away, Daniel continued cleaning alone. He pulled a warped cabinet away from the kitchen wall, swept years of dirt from beneath it, and stacked loose floorboards that had come free along one side of the room. As he stepped across them, one board suddenly gave way beneath his weight with a sharp crack. He stumbled backward just in time. The broken plank dropped several inches before hanging at an angle above complete darkness. Kneeling carefully, Daniel brushed away splintered wood and peered into the narrow opening beneath the floor. There was empty space below the house. Daniel remained kneeling beside the broken floorboard for several seconds, listening. The house was silent, except for rain tapping against the patched roof and water dripping into buckets scattered across the rooms. He picked up a flashlight from his toolbox and aimed its beam through the narrow opening. Instead of earth packed tightly beneath the foundation, he saw a shallow crawl space extending farther than he expected. Stone supports held up the floor joists, and years of dust covered everything below. "Well," he muttered to himself, "that's one more thing to fix." Yet something about the empty space unsettled his curiosity. Old houses often had crawl spaces, but this one looked unusually neat, almost as if someone had planned for people to enter it. He resisted the temptation to climb down immediately. The weakened floor could collapse further, and he was alone. Instead, he replaced the loose board as carefully as possible and drove into town the following morning to buy heavier gloves, a dust mask, and a longer flashlight. Before returning home, he stopped at the lumber yard. Noah looked up from cutting cedar planks. "You found another leak already?" Daniel smiled. "Something stranger. Part of the kitchen floor gave way." Noah wiped sawdust from his hands. "Bad enough to be dangerous." "Maybe. There's a space underneath, bigger than I expected." Noah leaned against the workbench. "Need another pair of hands?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'd appreciate it." They returned to the house together that afternoon, carrying pry bars, work lights, and a small stepladder. Noah examined the damaged floor, then carefully removed several weakened boards instead of forcing them apart. "Good thing you didn't jump in," he said. "The joists around the edge are still solid, but that center section isn't." Once enough flooring had been lifted, they lowered the ladder into the opening. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the smell of damp wood and old stone. Daniel descended first, while Noah held the ladder steady. The crawl space was just high enough to kneel comfortably. Thick spider webs stretched between the supports, and moisture had darkened parts of the stone foundation. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the chamber. Broken glass, rusted nails, fragments of old pottery. Nothing unusual at first. Noah climbed down beside him. "Looks like it's been closed up for a long time." They worked methodically, clearing loose debris into buckets. Near the back wall, Daniel noticed several flat stones arranged differently from the others. Unlike the rough foundation blocks, these formed a neat rectangle. He brushed away dirt with his gloved hand. "Take a look at this." Noah crouched beside him. "That doesn't belong here." Together, they scraped away years of packed dust. Iron hinges emerged along one edge, followed by the outline of a heavy wooden lid almost perfectly concealed beneath the stones. A rusted metal ring lay recessed into its center. "Some kind of storage hatch?" Noah guessed. Daniel wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled. Nothing happened. The wood refused to move. Noah wedged the end of a pry bar beneath one side while Daniel pulled again. Rust groaned. Dust billowed into the air. After several attempts, The hatch finally lifted a few inches before sticking again. They worked it back and forth until it opened enough to reveal a shallow compartment beneath. Inside rested a single wooden chest, reinforced with tarnished brass bands. Unlike everything else below the house, the chest appeared remarkably well preserved. It had been wrapped in layers of cracked oilcloth that kept much of the moisture away. Daniel ran one hand across the lid. Someone wanted this to survive. Noah nodded quietly. There was no lock, only a brass latch sealed by decades of corrosion. Working slowly to avoid damaging it, they loosened the latch with penetrating oil and gentle pressure. At last, the lid creaked open. Instead of coins or jewelry, they found stacks of cloth-wrapped notebooks arranged with surprising care. Each bundle had been tied with faded twine. The air carried the faint smell of old paper mixed with oil and cedar. Daniel carefully lifted the top bundle onto the floor above. They climbed out of the crawl space before unwrapping it beneath better light. The fabric crumbled at the edges, revealing several leather-bound journals. Their covers were worn smooth from handling, yet the pages inside remained dry. Every volume was filled with neat handwriting in dark brown ink. Dates stretched across many years during the middle of the 19th century. Daniel turned the first few pages with extraordinary care. Daily weather observations, notes about boats passing through the lock, lists of supplies, brief comments about crews working along the canal. "These aren't someone's personal diary," Noah whispered. "They're records." Daniel wasn't convinced. Mixed between routine entries were short reflections about exhausted workers, injuries, meals shared beside the water, and names repeated again and again. Whoever had written these pages had known the laborers personally. He reached for another notebook. Different handwriting, different dates. Another followed with yet another hand. "There are dozens of them," he said softly. Noah counted the bundles still inside the chest. "More than I expected anyone to hide." Daniel gently opened the oldest volume. The first page had yellowed with age but remained perfectly readable. Across the top, in careful script, someone had written a single sentence. He read it aloud, almost without breathing. "If you are reading these pages," his voice slowed as he reached the next line, "then at last, someone has come who is willing to listen to the men who built this canal." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Outside, rain continued falling against the roof, while the forgotten house stood silent around them, as though it had been waiting all those years for someone to open the chest hidden beneath its floor. The journals occupied nearly every inch of Daniel's kitchen table. He had spread clean towels beneath them to protect the brittle leather covers, and each time he opened another volume, he found himself slowing down, afraid a careless movement might damage pages that had survived more than a century beneath the floor. Noah returned early the next morning, carrying a pair of cotton gloves borrowed from the local library. "Figured these might help," he said. Daniel smiled gratefully. "I don't think I've ever been nervous about turning pages before." They began with the earliest dated journal, carefully comparing entries and arranging the notebooks in chronological order. Some handwriting flowed neatly across the paper, while others looked hurried. Written after long days of exhausting labor, the entries described weather, deliveries of stone, broken tools, flooded lock chambers, and crews struggling through freezing winters and unbearable summer heat. But scattered between ordinary records were deeply personal observations. One writer described sharing bread with an Irish laborer whose boots had completely fallen apart. Another wrote about a young German immigrant teaching songs to workers around an evening fire. There were stories of friendships, accidents, weddings, births, and letters from distant families that took months to arrive. Daniel leaned back after finishing one entry. These aren't just work records, Noah nodded. They're people's lives. By afternoon, Daniel realized many of the writers referred to one another by first name, creating a community that slowly came alive through the pages. Men celebrated completed sections of Canal, mourned co-workers who died from illness or injury, and spoke proudly about building something they believed would outlast them all. Yet something else began to stand out. Certain names appeared repeatedly for dozens of pages before disappearing without explanation. Daniel flipped backward through several journals, searching for one laborer named Patrick Doyle, who had been mentioned almost daily. The final reference simply noted that he had not returned after a rock slide. No further explanation followed. Another worker named Emil Hartman vanished the same way. So did Samuel Ortiz. Daniel frowned. It's like they simply stopped existing. Noah searched another volume. Here's another one. Thomas Riley, mentioned for months. Then nothing. The pattern repeated often enough that neither man believed it was coincidence. Wanting someone with more historical knowledge to examine the journals, Daniel remembered hearing about a retired local historian. After making several phone calls, he was given an address only a few miles away. Evelyn Brooks welcomed them into a modest farmhouse lined with overflowing bookshelves. Framed photographs of the old canal covered nearly every wall. Although she had retired from teaching local history years earlier, her eyes brightened the moment Daniel carefully placed one of the journals on her dining room table. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. "Inside the old lockkeeper's house." Evelyn adjusted her glasses before opening the first pages. She barely spoke for several minutes. Finally, she looked up, astonishment spreading across her face. "I've studied this canal for 40 years. She gently touched the faded ink. "I've never seen anything like these." Daniel explained how the chest had been hidden beneath the floor. Evelyn listened without interrupting, then carefully examined several additional journals. County records mention lockkeepers, engineers, contractors, and state officials, she said. But first-hand accounts from ordinary canal workers are almost unheard of. Most people who did the physical labor left very little behind. She paused over one page, listing names after a difficult week of blasting rock. Her expression changed. "That's odd." Daniel leaned forward. "What is it?" Evelyn reached for a thick reference book from her shelf and opened a section containing copies of official construction reports. She compared the pages carefully. This journal lists 12 workers assigned to one section that year. She pointed to the printed record. The official report mentions only 4. Daniel looked from the journal to the report and back again. Could they have transferred somewhere else? Evelyn slowly shook her head. Possible. But if so, there should still be payroll records or assignment lists. She continued comparing names from several journals against the official documents she owned. Again and again, workers described in vivid detail never appeared in government summaries. Others who clearly supervised difficult projects received only passing mention. "I've always assumed many records were simply lost," Evelyn admitted. "Now, I'm not so sure." Daniel felt the same quiet uneasiness growing inside him. Whoever wrote these journals clearly believed every worker mattered enough to remember individually. Yet the formal histories reduced entire crews to numbers or ignored them completely. They spent the remainder of the afternoon photographing selected pages and discussing preservation. Evelyn insisted the journals remain in Daniel's possession until they could be professionally examined. "The dry environment beneath that floor may have saved them," she explained. "Now we have to make sure they're protected properly." Before leaving, She carefully wrapped several acid-free folders around the most fragile volumes and handed Daniel a magnifying glass with built-in lighting. Some of the faded entries may become easier to read under brighter light. That evening, Daniel returned to the house feeling a responsibility he had never expected when he bought the property. Bankruptcy had left him searching only for a roof over his head. Instead, he now found himself caring for voices that had nearly disappeared forever. After supper, he opened another journal beneath the kitchen lamp. The handwriting was smaller than most, forcing him to use Evelyn's magnifier. Much of the entry described repairing lock gates after spring flooding. Then one sentence caught his attention. The writer mentioned that several names had already been omitted from the public account. Daniel read the paragraph twice before turning the page. Near the bottom, squeezed into the margin almost as an afterthought, another line appeared in darker ink. The complete list has been hidden where honest hands may someday find it. His pulse quickened. He scanned the remainder of the page until the final sentence stopped him completely. If these books are ever discovered before the list itself, remember this: the true record was not destroyed. It was placed somewhere beyond Lock 17. Daniel slowly closed the journal, staring toward the dark window as the abandoned canal lay silent outside, wondering what kind of list someone had believed was worth hiding for generations. Daniel barely slept after reading the final sentence in the journal. Before sunrise, he spread the notebooks across the kitchen table once again, searching for every mention of Lock 17. Most entries simply recorded routine workboats passing through, damaged gates repaired after storms, deliveries of timber and stone. But every few journals, another brief reference appeared. None explained what had been hidden there, yet the lock seemed to carry unusual importance. One writer described it as the quiet place beyond the traffic. Another simply wrote, "We met again near 17 after sunset." Daniel copied each reference into a notebook of his own. By mid-morning, Noah arrived carrying fresh lumber for the porch. Daniel showed him the latest passage. Noah read it twice before setting the journal down. If there's really something near Lock 17, we should at least find out where it is. Evelyn had already explained that many portions of the old canal system had changed over the years. Modern roads crossed sections that had once been isolated, and several lock numbers had disappeared from newer maps. Daniel unfolded the faded county map from the property records, while Noah searched online for historical survey maps. After nearly an hour of comparing landmarks, they identified the approximate location. Lock 17 lay less than a mile downstream from the house, hidden behind overgrown trees where the abandoned towpath curved away from the road. Before leaving, Daniel carefully packed one of the journals in a waterproof case. He wanted the relevant page with him in case they discovered anything matching its description. The walk along the canal took longer than expected. Fallen branches blocked sections of the old path, and thick weeds covered what had once been a well-traveled route for horses pulling canal boats. Every few hundred yards, Daniel stopped to compare the landscape with the faded map. Stone walls occasionally emerged beneath vines, reminding him that this quiet place had once been filled with workers, animals, and heavy cargo moving across the state. Eventually, the remains of another lock came into view. Much of the upper masonry had collapsed, but enough survived to reveal its original shape. Noah studied the weathered stone. Hard to imagine all this disappearing. Daniel nodded. The journals make it feel like yesterday. They searched carefully without disturbing more than necessary. Most of what they found consisted of broken bricks, rusted hardware, and fragments of old timber scattered by decades of floods. Hours passed without revealing anything unusual. Daniel began wondering if the journals referred to something long since destroyed. As they prepared to head back, Noah noticed a weathered stone marker leaning beside several trees. Moss almost completely covered its surface. Together, they brushed away dirt until faint carved numbers appeared. 17. Daniel looked around slowly. At least we know we're standing in the right place. Encouraged,
They widened their search. Near the edge of the former towpath, Daniel's boot struck something buried beneath leaves. He bent down and uncovered the corner of a flat stone, unlike the surrounding rubble. It had clearly been shaped by hand. Digging gently with a small trowel, he exposed more of its surface. A simple chisel mark crossed one corner, almost like a mason's personal signature.
This wasn't part of the lock wall,
Noah observed. Daniel agreed.
The stone seemed deliberately placed rather than broken away during collapse. They lifted it together. Beneath lay only compacted soil. No hidden compartment, no buried box. Still, the carefully positioned marker convinced Daniel they were closer to understanding the journals. While resting beside the canal, he opened the protected notebook and reread the page mentioning the complete list. One sentence stood out differently now. The writer had never said the list was inside Lock 17, only that it had been placed somewhere beyond it. Daniel looked farther downstream. Dense trees concealed much of the old canal corridor. "Maybe we've been searching too soon," he said. Noah followed his gaze. Beyond could mean another 100 yards, or another mile. Before they continued, the sound of an approaching vehicle echoed from a nearby gravel road. A county maintenance truck stopped beside the trail. The driver stepped out and greeted them politely. "Doing some hiking?" Daniel explained that he owned the old lockkeeper's house and had become interested in the canal's history. The man smiled. "Not many people are anymore." He glanced toward the ruins before adding, "Just be careful around the old stonework. Some areas aren't stable." There was no suspicion in his voice, only practical advice. After he drove away, Daniel and Noah decided to avoid unnecessary digging until they better understood what they were looking for. The journals deserved patience, not reckless searching. Back at the house that evening, Daniel was surprised to find a familiar car parked outside. Sarah stood on the porch with her arms folded, looking at the weathered brick walls. He had not seen his 19-year-old daughter in several weeks. "So, this is the place," she said as he walked up the steps. Daniel smiled uncertainly. "It's not much yet." She looked around the yard before meeting his eyes. "Honestly, it's about what I expected." He laughed softly. "That's fair." Inside, she noticed the carefully arranged journals covering the kitchen table. "These are what you mentioned on the phone?" Daniel nodded and briefly explained how he had discovered them beneath the floor. Sarah picked up one volume with surprising gentleness. "They're beautiful." He watched her study the faded handwriting, for the first time in months. They spent nearly an hour talking without awkward silence. She asked about the repairs, the old canal, and the people whose stories filled the pages. Before leaving, she squeezed his shoulder. "I still think buying this house was a crazy idea," she admitted with a small smile. "But maybe it wasn't the worst one you've ever had." After she drove away, Daniel returned to the journals with renewed determination. He opened another notebook, written several years after the others, and found a rough, hand-drawn map folded between its pages. Most of the canal appeared only as simple lines, but one location had been marked with unusual care. A narrow trail extended beyond Lock 17 toward a place identified only by a small circle. There were no written directions, only a single symbol beside the circle, a carved stone exactly like the one he and Noah had uncovered that afternoon. Daniel looked up from the map, realizing their search had only just begun. The hand-drawn map stayed folded in Daniel's pocket all night. By morning, he had already compared it with every historical map Evelyn had loaned him, and although the rough sketch lacked measurements, one detail remained consistent. The narrow trail extended beyond Lock 17 toward a small rise overlooking the canal. When Noah arrived, carrying replacement porch boards, Daniel spread the maps across the kitchen table. "I think I know where the symbol points," he said. Noah studied the faded lines before nodding. "Only one way to find out." Before leaving, Daniel called Sarah. He expected her voicemail, but she answered almost immediately. "Heading back to the house?" she asked. "Actually, we're following another clue." He explained the map and the carved stone they had uncovered. There was a brief pause before she surprised him. "Give me 20 minutes. I'd like to come." Daniel smiled after ending the call. A week earlier, he would never have imagined his daughter volunteering to spend a day exploring an abandoned canal with him. They met outside the house just before noon. Sarah wore hiking boots and carried a small backpack with bottled water, work gloves, and a portable scanner. "If we find anything written," she explained, "I can make digital copies before the pages get damaged." Daniel looked at her proudly. "That's a good idea." Together, the three of them followed the overgrown towpath beyond Lock 17, using the hand-drawn map as their guide. They pushed through patches of brush until the old trail climbed gently away from the canal. Fallen branches covered much of the ground, making slow progress necessary. After nearly half an hour, Noah stopped beside a cluster of large oak trees. "The map shows the trail bending here." Daniel compared the surrounding landscape with the sketch. A low ridge rose ahead of them, partially hidden beneath ferns. As they reached the top, the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing overlooking the abandoned waterway below. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Sarah pointed toward several weathered wooden posts protruding from the ground in uneven rows. "Those aren't fence posts." They walked closer. Time had nearly erased the carved lettering, but careful brushing revealed faint names scratched into the gray wood. One marker carried only initials. Another displayed a first name with no surname remaining. A third simply read, "Age 23." Daniel stood silently among the forgotten markers. None looked official. There were no stone monuments, no iron fences, only simple pieces of wood placed with quiet care long ago. Noah removed his cap without saying a word. "Someone remembered them," he finally whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. "Even if nobody else did." Sarah photographed each marker before the fading inscriptions disappeared completely. Several names matched those Daniel had read inside the journals, including Patrick Doyle and Emil Hartman, workers who had vanished from the written records without explanation. Seeing those names again, carved into fragile wood instead of government documents, made the journals feel painfully real. These were no longer stories preserved on paper. They had been people who laughed, worked, and died beside the canal. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. "They built something that lasted generations," he said quietly. "And this is all that was left to remember them." They spent the next hour gently clearing weeds from the small clearing without disturbing the markers. Near the far edge, Daniel noticed several flat stones arranged in a rough circle. Beneath leaves lay fragments of broken wooden crosses, carefully stacked rather than scattered. Nothing suggested vandalism. Time alone had nearly reclaimed the place. Sarah knelt beside one marker and softly traced the carved letters with her fingertips. "Imagine having family somewhere who never knew where you ended up." Daniel looked toward the canal stretching through the trees. Maybe that's why the journals mattered so much to whoever hid them. Clouds gathered overhead while they continued documenting the clearing. Before long, distant thunder rolled across the valley. Noah looked toward the sky. We should head back before this turns ugly. They had barely reached the old trail when heavy rain began falling. Within minutes, the narrow path became slippery with mud. Water rushed downhill toward the canal, carrying loose soil with it. As they approached Lock 17, Daniel noticed fresh earth collapsing near the edge of the ruined stone wall. "Watch your footing," Noah called. A section of the bank suddenly gave way, sending rocks tumbling into the lock chamber below. They backed away immediately. The storm intensified, making further searching impossible. By the time they reached the house, everyone was soaked despite their rain jackets. Inside, Sarah immediately unpacked the portable scanner and began digitizing the journal pages they had already identified, while Daniel carefully spread damp maps across the table to dry. "If anything happens to the originals," she said, "at least we'll have copies." Daniel watched her work with quiet gratitude. Months earlier, their conversations rarely lasted more than a few uncomfortable minutes. Now they worked side by side without forcing words. Noah repaired one final leak above the kitchen before preparing to leave. "We'll have to wait until the ground dries before going back," he said. "Too dangerous otherwise." Daniel agreed. Rushing now would risk damaging both the site and themselves. Later that evening, after Sarah drove home, Daniel returned to the journals. The rain drummed steadily against the roof while he opened another volume that had received little attention because its cover was badly worn. Several pages had stuck together over time. Working patiently, he separated them one at a time. Near the back, he discovered an envelope tucked into the binding. Inside rested a small tin case sealed with wax that had somehow survived the decades. Unlike the wooden chest beneath the floor, this container had clearly been hidden inside the journal itself. Daniel carefully turned it over in his hands. Whatever rested inside had remained protected through every passing season since the day someone placed it there. He took a slow breath before gently breaking the brittle seal. Inside the tin case lay a folded letter and a narrow bundle of pages tied with black thread. Daniel carried them to the kitchen table before touching anything further. The paper had darkened at the edges, but the wax seal around the case had protected it from moisture. He put on the cotton gloves Noah had brought and unfolded the letter beneath the lamp. The handwriting matched several entries from the final journal, although the lines were shakier, as if written by an older hand. At the top was a name, Elias Voss, last keeper of Lock 17. Daniel read slowly. Elias wrote that he had served the canal during its final years, long after the busiest boats had disappeared. By then, abandoned equipment rusted beside the towpath. Lock walls cracked, and officials spoke openly about closing the route. He had inherited the journals from earlier keepers who believed someone must preserve the workers' own accounts. Each generation had added names, stories, and corrections to records that ignored the men who performed the hardest labor. When the canal offices began clearing old documents, Elias feared the journals would be taken or destroyed. He hid most beneath the floor of the keeper's house and concealed the final volume inside the tin case. Daniel's hands tightened around the paper. Elias had not hidden treasure. He had hidden testimony. The pages tied with black thread proved to be the old man's personal memoir. Daniel read until the rain weakened outside. Elias described patrolling empty locks, repairing gates no commercial boat would ever use again, and watching weeds reclaim the paths where hundreds once worked. He wrote of visiting the small clearing beyond Lock 17, replacing wooden markers when he could, and memorizing names that weather had nearly erased. One entry mentioned Patrick Doyle, Emil Hartman, Thomas Riley, and dozens of others Daniel now recognized. Elias had never met most of them, but previous keepers had passed down their stories. Near midnight, Daniel called Evelyn. He apologized for the late hour, but after hearing what he had found, she asked him to bring the letter the next morning. Evelyn received him at her dining table with several reference books already open. She examined the signature under magnification, then searched through copies of old Canal rosters. "Elias Voss," she said at last. "He appears here as a maintenance keeper during the Canal's final operating years, but there is almost nothing else about him." Daniel placed the memoir beside the roster. "He says he was the last keeper at Lock 17. Evelyn read several pages in silence. Her expression softened when she reached the passage describing the memorial clearing. "My grandmother used to tell a story about a keeper who walked the towpath carrying flowers," she said. "She never knew his name. People thought he was eccentric because he left them in the woods." Daniel looked at the memoir. "He was taking them to the workers' markers?" Evelyn nodded. "It seems so." Her family had lived near the canal for generations, and she remembered another fragment of local memory. An older relative once claimed that a keeper refused to surrender certain papers when officials closed a maintenance office. No one knew what documents he protected, and over time the story became little more than gossip. Elias's memoir now gave it shape. He wrote that the papers were safer forgotten than placed in the hands of men who had already reduced the workers to anonymous labor. Daniel asked the question that had troubled him since opening the chest. Who was he protecting? Evelyn turned several pages before answering. Not one person. All of them. Their names, their families, and whoever might one day come looking for proof that they were here. Yet the official records remained a problem. Evelyn contacted a regional archive while Daniel waited. The archivist confirmed that many payroll books and construction ledgers from the canal's earliest decades were missing. Some had been damaged by floods. Others were discarded during office closures. Without those files, proving every journal entry would be difficult. Daniel felt frustration rising. So the records that could confirm these men are the same records that disappeared. Yes, Evelyn said, but missing records do not make these journals meaningless. They make careful verification more important. They spent the afternoon comparing dates, weather reports, lock repairs, and names against every surviving source Evelyn owned. Small details matched repeatedly. A flood described in one diary corresponded to a newspaper report from the same week. A damaged gate mentioned by 2 workers appeared in a state maintenance summary. Even supply deliveries aligned with surviving invoices. The journals were not legends written long afterward. They were contemporary accounts. Before Daniel left, Evelyn asked to scan Elias's memoir so she could preserve a working copy. He agreed, but kept the original protected between archival folders. Back at the house, Noah arrived to inspect the storm damage. Daniel told him about Elias while they replaced a loosened roof patch. Noah listened quietly. All those years alone out here, and he kept taking care of people who were already gone. Maybe he thought no one else would. After the repairs, Daniel returned to the memoir. Several later pages described Elias sealing the chest beneath the floor. He believed the house might be abandoned, sold, or demolished, but hoped that one day someone would recognize the carved lock numbers and follow the worker's trail. Daniel glanced toward the marked doorframe. What he had mistaken for meaningless scratches had been a guide. The final pages grew increasingly brief. Elias wrote of failing health, the canal's closure, and his fear that the memorial clearing would vanish after him. The last entry was not dated. A separate envelope had been pressed against the back cover, addressed only to the one who opens this. Daniel slid a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single sheet containing no map, no names, and no explanation of where the complete list lay. It held only one final request, written in the unsteady hand of a man who knew his work was ending. I have kept their voices as long as I could. Whoever finds them next, do not let them be forgotten again. Within 3 days, Evelyn had created a careful inventory of every journal, memoir page, letter, and photograph connected to the lockkeeper's house. Sarah organized the digital scans into folders labeled by date, writer, and location, while Daniel cleared the front room so the documents could be examined without risking damage from dust or leaking rain. Noah built a simple table from leftover boards and fitted temporary shutters over the broken windows. The house still looked abandoned from the road, but inside it had begun to feel less like a ruin and more like a place with a purpose. Evelyn suggested sharing a small selection of the findings with the town before rumors distorted the truth. Daniel hesitated. He had owned the house only a few weeks, and the attention made him uncomfortable. Still, Elias's final request had been clear. The workers could not be remembered if their stories remained hidden. Evelyn wrote a short notice for the local historical society describing the journals without exaggeration. Sarah added several photographs of the carved names from the clearing beyond Lock 17. Within days, people began arriving at the house. Some came out of curiosity. Others brought family stories about ancestors who had worked along the canal. An elderly woman carried a faded photograph of a man holding a shovel beside an unfinished lock wall. A retired teacher brought an old Bible with a surname matching one recorded in the journals. Not every connection could be proven, but each visit added another piece to the forgotten community. Daniel listened to every story, remembering how invisible he had felt after losing his company. These workers had experienced something far greater than financial failure. Their labor had remained while their identities disappeared. He understood why Elias had refused to let them vanish completely. The growing interest also created practical problems. The house was unsafe for crowds. The roof still leaked in 2 rooms, and the porch could not support more than a few people at once. Noah placed warning signs around weakened areas and refused to let anyone enter the kitchen without supervision. History won't matter much if the floor swallows somebody, he said. Daniel agreed, though he worried about the cost of repairs. His remaining money was nearly gone. Then a local newspaper published Evelyn's account of the discovery. The article included a photograph of Daniel standing beside the journals, looking far more confident than he felt. By the end of the week, small donations began arriving. $10 from a retired couple, $25 from a teacher, $50 from a family whose surname appeared in one of the notebooks. A hardware store donated roofing supplies, and volunteers offered to clear brush from the property. Daniel was overwhelmed by the response. He had spent months believing people saw him only as a failed businessman. Now strangers trusted him to protect something that belonged to all of them. Sarah came every afternoon after work to help answer messages and continue scanning pages. One evening, she showed him a social media post she had written about Elias and the memorial clearing. Hundreds of people had shared it. "My friends keep asking when they can visit," she said. Daniel smiled. "You're telling your friends about this place?" "I'm telling them about you, too." She said it casually, but the words stopped him. For years, their relationship had been reduced to missed calls, cautious conversations, and old disappointments. He had assumed she was embarrassed by him. Now she introduced him as the man who had found and protected the canal workers' diaries. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sarah looked down at the scanner. "You didn't give up on the house or the people in those books." She met his eyes. "I'm starting to understand that." The progress drew official attention. Mayor Richard Collins requested a meeting at the town hall. He listened politely as Evelyn explained the journals, the memorial clearing, and the missing names. Collins did not dismiss the discovery, but his concern was obvious. The town had already been negotiating with private developers over a tourism project near the Canal corridor. New trails, rental cabins, and commercial spaces were expected to bring badly needed revenue. An expanded historical protection zone could delay permits and increase costs. "I respect what you found," Collins said, "but we need verified facts before changing development plans." Daniel placed copies of several journal pages on the table. "These people built the canal. Their names deserve more than being treated as an inconvenience." Collins sighed. "I'm not saying they don't. I'm saying the council needs evidence strong enough to defend any decision publicly." Evelyn explained that they were comparing the journals with surviving state records. Collins agreed to allow a presentation at the next council meeting, but made no promise of official recognition. Outside the town hall, Daniel felt the weight of the challenge. Community support was growing, yet sympathy alone would not protect the clearing or restore the workers' names. They needed a complete, reliable list. Back at the house, Sarah combined names from the journals, carved markers, Elias's memoir, and surviving reports into one database. For days they checked spellings, repeated entries, and conflicting dates. Evelyn verified nationalities and work assignments where possible. Noah photographed every remaining marker after the ground dried. Slowly, the list expanded beyond 200 individuals. Some names appeared fully, others survived only as initials or partial surnames. Daniel refused to discard them. Even an incomplete name proved that someone had existed. Late one afternoon, Sarah read aloud the final count. 217 workers could now be identified with reasonable confidence. The number filled the room with silence. Daniel looked at the journals and imagined the men moving along the canal, unaware that generations later, strangers would fight to return their names to history. "Will the council recognize them?" Sarah asked. Daniel had no answer. Before he could respond, a car stopped outside. A middle-aged woman stepped onto the porch holding a copy of the newspaper article and an old family photograph. Her hands trembled as she introduced herself. Then she pointed to one of the names printed beneath the article. "That man was my great-great-grandfather," she said. "My family has been searching for what happened to him for more than 60 years. Daniel hardly slept that night. Long after the lights inside the house had been turned off, he sat alone at the kitchen table where the journals had first been spread across old towels. The same room that had once smelled only of damp wood and neglect now held carefully labeled archival boxes, digital copies stored on Sarah's laptop, and folders filled with notes from Evelyn's research. A few weeks earlier, he had believed buying the abandoned lockkeeper's house for $150 had been the desperate mistake of a bankrupt man with nowhere else to go. Now the future of hundreds of forgotten voices seemed to rest inside its weathered walls. Shortly after sunrise, cars began arriving outside the town hall. Families who had traced their ancestors through the journals stood beside longtime residents who simply wanted to witness the decision. Noah parked beside Daniel's truck and quietly handed him a cup of coffee. "Whatever happens," he said, "you already kept your promise to Elias." Daniel looked toward the old canal visible beyond the trees. "I hope that's enough." Sarah joined them a moment later, carrying the protective case containing one of the journals. She smiled at her father, not with sympathy, but with confidence. "Let's go." The council chamber filled quickly. Mayor Richard Collins thanked everyone for their patience before reading the official resolution. The council had unanimously voted to recognize the journals as an authentic and historically significant collection, deserving permanent preservation. The memorial clearing beyond Lock 17 would receive protected historical status while additional research continued. Most importantly, the town formally acknowledged the documented canal workers whose names had been recovered through the journals. Elias Voss's memoir, surviving state records, family archives, and local historical research. A quiet murmur spread through the audience before giving way to sustained applause. Margaret Doyle lowered her head and wept openly. Several other descendants embraced one another. Daniel remained seated for a moment, hardly believing the words he had just heard. Months earlier, he had stood in a courtroom, losing everything he had spent 2 decades building. Today, he watched an entire room celebrate people who had waited generations simply to be remembered. After the meeting, Mayor Collins approached Daniel personally. "I owe you something," he said. Daniel looked surprised. Collins smiled modestly. "When I first heard about the journals, I worried they would complicate the town's future. I was thinking about budgets, permits, and construction schedules." He glanced toward the families gathered outside. "You reminded us that communities aren't built only with new projects. They're built on people whose stories deserve to survive." Daniel shook his hand. "Thank you for listening." Collins nodded. "Thank you for insisting." Over the following months, volunteers transformed the neglected lockkeeper's house with remarkable care. Noah organized crews to repair the roof properly, reinforce the floors, restore the original brickwork, and rebuild the porch using designs based on historical photographs. Local businesses donated paint, lumber, and hardware. Retired craftsmen volunteered weekends to restore doors and windows rather than replacing them. College students helped catalog the journals under Evelyn's supervision. Sarah coordinated digital archives so researchers and descendants could study the collection without handling the fragile originals. The house slowly regained the quiet dignity it had possessed during the canal's busiest years. Daniel insisted that every improvement respected the building's history. The carved lock numbers remained visible beneath protective coverings. The repaired section of kitchen floor included a glass viewing panel showing the location where the hidden chest had rested for generations. Visitors often stood silently there, amazed that such an ordinary corner of an old house had protected one of the community's greatest historical discoveries. The memorial clearing beyond Lock 17 also changed, though only gently. The weathered wooden markers were carefully documented before being preserved. A simple stone monument was placed nearby, not to replace the original memorial, but to protect its story. The recovered names were engraved in alphabetical order beneath a single inscription, "In honor of the men who built the canal and were remembered at last." There were no grand speeches when the monument was completed. Families simply walked among the trees, placing flowers beside names they had searched for across generations. Margaret Doyle rested one hand against Patrick Doyle's engraved name before quietly thanking Daniel through tears. "Now my grandchildren will know where he rests," she said. "They'll know he didn't disappear." Similar conversations echoed throughout the afternoon as descendants met one another for the first time. Some discovered shared family histories, others compared old letters with passages from the journals. What had begun as one bankrupt man's search for shelter had become the reunion of families separated by history itself. Several months later, the restored lockkeeper's house officially opened as a small community museum and research center. The ceremony remained intentionally simple.
Evelyn spoke briefly about the importance of preserving ordinary lives rather than only famous names. Noah thanked the volunteers who had rebuilt the house board by board. Mayor Collins announced that local schools would include the canal workers' stories in future history programs. Then Sarah invited her father to join her at the front entrance. Together they cut the ribbon while neighbors, descendants, historians, and volunteers applauded. Daniel stepped inside and watched visitors slowly move through the rooms. Children studied maps of the canal. Elderly couples read passages from the journals displayed beneath protective glass. Descendants searched the engraved list for familiar surnames. No one hurried. Everyone seemed to understand they were walking through a place that had nearly been forgotten forever. Late that afternoon, the crowds finally thinned. Evelyn locked the display cases while Noah switched off the workshop lights. Sarah lingered near the kitchen, looking down through the glass panel covering the place where the chest had once been hidden. "Funny," she said softly. "You bought this house because you thought you had nothing left." Daniel smiled. "Turns out I just hadn't found what I was supposed to protect yet." She slipped her arm around his. "I'm proud of you, Dad." The words meant more than any financial success he had ever known. After everyone left, Daniel remained alone for a few quiet minutes. He picked up the final journal, now safely preserved inside its archival cover, and gently opened to the first page. The familiar sentence still waited there, unchanged after all those years. If you are reading these pages, then at last, someone has come who is willing to listen to the men who built this canal. Daniel closed the journal with care and looked through the front window. Families were still walking along the towpath toward the memorial clearing. Children asking questions their grandparents could finally answer. The abandoned house purchased for $150 no longer stood forgotten beside a silent canal. It had become a place where history spoke again. For the first time since leaving the bankruptcy courthouse, Daniel no longer measured his life by everything he had lost. He measured it by the names that would never be forgotten again. And as the evening sun settled over the old waterway, he smiled, knowing that both the canal workers and the man who had found their diaries had finally found their way home. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Doyle. She carefully unfolded the worn photograph she had carried inside a protective envelope and placed it beside the journals. 3 young men stood shoulder to shoulder in work clothes, their faces serious beneath broad hats. She pointed to the tallest. "My grandmother always believed this was Patrick Doyle," she said softly, "but no one ever knew where he died. His name simply disappeared from every record we could find." Daniel opened the journal containing Patrick's final entries and carefully turned to the page Evelyn had marked days earlier. The writer described Patrick helping repair a damaged lock gate after heavy rain, joking with the crew despite exhaustion, then being caught in a sudden rock slide several days later. There was no dramatic ending, only a quiet sentence noting that the men buried their friend overlooking the canal until his family could someday be found. Margaret covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "All these years," she whispered, "we thought he had abandoned everyone." Daniel gently slid the journal toward her. He didn't. Someone made sure he would be remembered. She read silently for several minutes before thanking him through tears. News of Margaret's visit spread quickly. Over the following week, more families arrived carrying faded letters, family Bibles, immigration papers, and photographs passed down through generations. Some had heard stories about ancestors who vanished while working on the canal. Others only recognized a surname listed in the newspaper.
Daniel welcomed every visitor into the house, despite its unfinished condition. The journals were no longer simply historical documents. They had become bridges reconnecting families with relatives they believed had been lost forever. Sarah organized appointments so the fragile notebooks would not be handled constantly.
Noah built simple display cases with glass panels donated by a local hardware store.
Evelyn compared every new family record against the journals and the growing master list. Some connections remained uncertain, but many matched remarkably well. Birthplaces aligned with diary entries. Family names appeared in church records.
Dates corresponded with surviving payroll fragments preserved in the state archive.
Each confirmation strengthened the credibility of the collection. A week before the scheduled council meeting, Evelyn received copies of additional state maintenance records from the regional archive. They were incomplete, but several pages contained signatures of lock supervisors approving work crews during the same years covered by the journals. Daniel spread the copies across the table beside the original notebooks. Although the official documents listed fewer workers, the dates, construction sections, and repair projects matched repeatedly. "This is what we needed," Evelyn said. "Independent confirmation."
Daniel smiled with quiet relief.
"Enough for the council. Enough to show these journals were written by people who were actually here." Sarah spent 2 evenings assembling a presentation using the scanned documents, photographs from the memorial clearing, and comparisons between official records and the workers' own accounts. She kept the focus simple.
The goal was not to accuse anyone in the present. It was to restore names that history had gradually forgotten.
When the evening of the council meeting arrived, the room filled far beyond its normal capacity. Residents stood along the walls while descendants of canal workers quietly occupied the front rows.
Margaret Doyle sat beside several other families who had recently discovered their own connections through the journals.
Daniel had spoken in business meetings throughout his career, yet this felt entirely different. Bankruptcy hearings and negotiations had been about contracts and money. Tonight he carried responsibility for people who could no longer speak for themselves.
Evelyn opened the presentation by explaining the historical importance of first-hand journals written by canal workers and lockkeepers.
Sarah then displayed photographs of the memorial clearing and the carved wooden markers. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, holding one of the journals inside its protective case.
He read a short passage describing workers sharing bread after completing another difficult section of canal.
The words were ordinary, honest, and unmistakably human. Silence filled the room when he finished. Several descendants quietly wiped away tears. Council members asked careful questions about preservation, authenticity, and documentation.
Evelyn answered each one with supporting evidence from the state records,
Church documents, surviving invoices, and family archives. No single document proved every name, but together they formed a consistent historical record that could no longer be ignored. Mayor Richard Collins listened throughout without interruption. When the final questions ended,
he thanked everyone who had contributed to the research.
"This council has a responsibility to protect the history of our community," he said. "We also have a responsibility to verify what becomes part of the public record." He looked toward Daniel before continuing. "The evidence presented tonight deserves serious consideration."
The council members quietly reviewed the recommendation prepared by Evelyn and the Historical Society.
It proposed recognizing the journals as an important local historical collection, preserving the memorial clearing, and beginning the process of adding the documented workers' names to the town's official canal history. No one in the room spoke while the council discussed the proposal. Daniel glanced toward Sarah. She gave him a reassuring smile. Months earlier, she had doubted every decision he made. Now she sat proudly beside him. Whatever happened next, that alone felt like a victory. At last, Mayor Collins gathered the papers before him and looked across the crowded room. "The council has reached its decision," he said. "Tomorrow morning we will announce our official resolution regarding the journals, the memorial site, and the recognition of the canal workers whose names have been recovered." The room remained completely still, as everyone realized they would have to wait one more night to learn whether generations of forgotten builders would finally receive the place in history they had long been denied. Some people will tell you this is a story about a bankrupt man who bought a forgotten lockkeeper's house for just $150. Others will say it's the story of a hidden chest filled with century-old canal workers' diaries. But I think the real treasure was never hidden beneath the floorboards. It was hidden in the names of ordinary men whose lives had quietly disappeared from history until someone cared enough to listen. Daniel never became rich because of that old house. He didn't uncover gold, priceless artifacts, or a fortune waiting to be claimed. What he found was something far more valuable, a purpose that no bankruptcy court could ever take away. By preserving those journals, restoring the lockkeeper's house, and helping families reconnect with ancestors they thought had been lost forever, he proved that even after losing everything, a person can still change countless lives. Sometimes life closes one door, not because our story is over, but because it's leading us toward the chapter we were always meant to write. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this old canal house. Success isn't measured by how much we own, but by what we choose to protect, the people we choose to remember, and the legacy we leave behind for those who come after us. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know what part stayed with you the most. Have you ever discovered an old family story, a forgotten photograph, or a place that made you feel connected to the past? Share your experience in the comments, because every family has a history worth remembering. And if you enjoy stories about hidden American heritage, forgotten places, and the ordinary people who quietly shaped history, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey. Until then, thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and may you never underestimate the power of remembering those the world almost forgot.